This is a video review of the most missed questions in Module 3 quiz Part B. There are a large number of students in the class that did very well in Module 3, but there's still a good number that are not doing so well. And in my experience, I would say it's because there's not enough time put in for study, and they're not approaching these Part B questions by thinking and trying to integrate information. So let me see if I can help out as I go through here. The first question I want to review is the very first one. Identify the organ represented by this specimen. Now the correct answer was the thymus, but you can see some people thought it was the tonsil, the lymph node, and none of the above. So when you're looking at an organ, just like you were looking at tissues, you have to think of differential diagnosis. So you have to begin to try to narrow it down and say, well, what can this be? Well, we know it's an organ. That's pretty simple. But what kind? I mean, first of all, you haven't studied very many organs. You've studied the cardiovascular organs, right? You've studied the lymphoid organs, right? And you've studied the skin. Okay, and actually, and then some tissues, bone marrow, and things like that. So of the ones you've studied, I mean, we're certainly not going to ask questions about organs you haven't studied, but it's very interesting to me that, in my experience in this course, that students will also sometimes give answers for an organ that they study later in the semester, like for something like this. They might say this is, say, the lung. They haven't even studied that yet. So it's important to know, what is your repertoire, or what are your list of possibilities? And so in this case, it's got to be the lymphoid organs, cardiovascular, or the integument, right? Let's just verify that for a moment. So going to Module 3 and the topics you studied, you were introduced to organs by the features that distinguish them, and you were taught in Lecture 15 about the hollow and the solid organs. And of those, you've now studied the cardiovascular organs, the heart and the blood vessels, and the lymphoid organs, and the integument. So those are the possible organs. There are no other organs that we would ask you about at this point in the course. So now back to the organ in question. Here it is. So you see a lot of blue staining. That should remind you immediately of lymphocytes. And so you have to magnify this in order to see the details. And indeed, it is just saturated with lymphocytes. And it has connective tissue dividing the organ into segments, and those segments would be lobules. You also have a lighter stained area and darker stained, reminding one, if you studied, of the cortex and medulla. So how do you know for sure? Because you've got these dark cortex areas, but you might ask, are they organized into nodules? Well, no, it's rather smooth, okay? And so, but you also have a very key feature, and that is the Hassel's corpuscle. And this is a huge one here. But if you go to, let's say, go to other areas of the medulla, of the thymus, there's a very tiny Hassel's corpuscle. Here is a high endothelial vessel, or a venule in the medulla. And let's see, I could find another Hassel's corpuscle here forming. And so this is thymus. And those are the features. And you must know how to distinguish the thymus from the lymph node and the spleen, because those are the closest ones. And obviously the cardiovascular organs, that's easy. Okay, let's go on to the next question. So this question now, select the true statement about the organ presented. So you've got to identify the organ. Well, it actually was the spleen. And the spleen reacts to antigens in blood. So this is a case you have to identify the organ, which was spleen. And you can see it does not have a cortex and medulla. These nodules, these splenic nodules, are scattered throughout. And you can double check and find central arteries associated with the nodules. And you see a capsule up here. But you also have to know, if this is a spleen, you know, what's its function? And so part of its function is react to antigens in blood. Remember, the lymph node reacts to antigens in lymph. So the correct answer reacts to antigens in blood. It doesn't produce CD4 and CD8 lymphocytes. What organ produces that? Thymus. Antibodies produced intercirculation by way of efferent lymphatics, lymph node. Produces platelets, megakaryocytes in bone marrow. Is one of the sites for recirculation of T lymphocytes? No, not the spleen, but in the lymph nodes. Okay, let's go to the next question. Okay, this one was tonsil. Identify the organ encircled. A number of students thought it was the a lymph node. Let's see. Okay, so here we have lymphatic nodules, right, but you don't see a clear cortex and medulla. You only see these nodules, and then you have to remember that the tonsil is associated with epithelium. And here's stratified squamous, non-keratinized epithelium. So this has all the features of tonsil, and this is actually a part of the tongue. Over here is the surface of the tongue, and these are mucous glandular cells in the tongue. And here's another little portion of that tonsil. Okay, but certainly not the lymph node. Okay, let's go to the next question. Would be number 8. So number 8 here is identify the organ represented by the virtual slide specimen. Well, this was, and we indicated that the arrows indicate the tissue layer that lines the lumen, and we told you this was a longitudinal section profile. That's the other thing to remind you of when you are going through a test. Slow down and read the question carefully. Ask yourself the following questions. What's the subject of the sentence? What's the verb? And what's the predicate? What is it, what it's asking about? Is it asking something it does or location? Make sure you understand all of the descriptors in that question. So this was the large vein. So you have to now, what are the features of a large vein? Well, some people thought it was a large artery, others a medium or a muscular artery. But you see, here is the lumen, and then if you look at that carefully, you see some smooth muscle cells. This would be the intima area here. This would be the media, and then you have layers of some elastic fibers and membranes, but you'll have these smooth muscle cells. You see the nucleus in the center of the eosinophilic cytoplasm. Okay, if you remembered the lecture and remembered some of your lab work, then this would be a large vein. If it were a large artery, you would see multiple layers of elastic membranes, and you would see a few smooth muscle cells. If it was a medium artery, you would see just layers of pure smooth muscle, like this would be repeated over and over throughout the medium. Okay, this vessel, or this, not vessel, but question number 9, identify the organ enclosed with a dotted line. Well, that was a distributing artery, but about 30% of the class thought it was a large artery. Now let's take a look at this. Remember, a large artery would be aorta, and it would have multiple layers of elastic membrane. So you had to enlarge this and look carefully. It does not, we have one elastic membrane here. It may be a little bit out here, but this is the adventitia. This is the media, which is almost a pure culture of smooth muscle cells. Look at the very long, squiggly nuclei here, very characteristic. Then out of here you have some adipose tissue. Okay, so that is a muscular or distributing artery. Okay, question 12. A group of structures is brought to your attention with lumens encircled. And in what region of this organ are they present? And that was the hypodermis and the integument. But some, well, there was a scattered, but most of the people that chose the correct answer said dermis reticular layer. Now let's see about this. Okay, here's where they are located. These are actually apocrine sweat glands. And you see they have very large lumen. And these are the secretory portion here. And let's see where they're located. Okay, we go down lower magnification. Here is the epidermis. This is the papillary layer of the dermis. This is the reticular layer here, dense irregular connective tissue. And down here, underneath that, this is the hypodermis. So let's see what the choices were on that. Only one possible choice. They were definitely not in the reticular layer and not in the epidermis. Okay, question 14. The blood vessel with a black dot in its lumen receives blood from which of the listed blood vessels? Well, immediately you should be thinking of not to identify the vessel that we're going to indicate, but you're going to think about that vessel and think about where does it receive blood from? What vessel is just before it in the circulatory system? And that would be the muscular artery. And why would that be right? Because this was an arteriole. Look carefully. You see, you've got about 3 or 4 layers of smooth muscle cells of their nuclei around the lumen. That's clearly an arteriole. So what does it receive blood from? Well, first of all, you have the large artery, aorta, from the heart. And then you have the branching out distributing arteries, also alias muscular arteries or alias distributing arteries. And so the smaller ones of those feed into this arteriole. And so the correct answer was a muscular artery, not an arteriole. You see, if you didn't read the question carefully, you would have chosen arteriole. And you would have been identifying the vessel that we presented, but that's not what we ask. Okay, question 15. You were presented actually with a segment of the GI tract, and it was actually esophagus. And we didn't ask you to identify the GI tract. We asked you to identify the tissues in the described areas that we indicated. And the correct answer for layer 1 was epithelium, connective tissue, and smooth muscle, and that's the mucosa. For layer 2, it was connective tissue and adipose tissue. For layer 3, it was striated skeletal muscle, smooth muscle, and connective tissue. And for layer 4, it was just connective tissue. Okay, so let's take a look. Layer 1. If you magnify this, you've got stratified squamous, non-keratinized epithelium. You have connective tissue. And then underneath here, you have smooth muscle cells. You see these pink cells? They're cut in cross-section with nuclei in the center of some and not in others. So that's layer 1. Layer 2, okay, layer 2 was, and this is stained with trichrome, and that was given in the question. And you have adipose tissue and connective tissue, collagen. Okay, and so then layer 3 was a combination of smooth muscle and skeletal muscle. See the cross-section of skeletal muscle when wrapped in connective tissue? And then over here are patches of smooth muscle. You see the cells that are solid, and you have to look around. There's nuclei in the center of the cells. Some areas are a little more clear than others. That's why you should look around. Say over here, you can see the smooth muscle cells here. And then the last layer, number 4, that was loose connective tissue. Just plain connective tissue is all we wanted for that. So if we put this back over here and we look at the layer 4, connective tissue only. All right, so hopefully that will remind you of the features of the 4 basic tissues. We actually didn't have any nerve tissue in there, and I don't think there's any present here. This is just some dense connective tissue out here. I was just looking around to see if I can see some nerve fibers. Nope, there are none there. But at least you have this muscle 2 times, smooth and skeletal, and you have the collagen, adipose tissue, and then the epithelium, the stratified squamous, non-keratinized epithelium. Okay, question number 16 was a type-in answer, and about 53% of the class got it correct. You were presented with two vascular structures, and you were asked to say which one, A or B, would be the one that would be the preferential site for migration of circulating blood neutrophils into the tissues. So here are the two vessels. You can see A and B, and if you magnify that, you can see A has smooth muscle cells around it, fairly large in diameter, and B has just one single layer of endothelial cells. See the flat nucleus here, and red blood cells, and there could be white blood cells anywhere in this vessel, and this is to be a venial. And most likely we could classify that as a postcapillary venial, and that's where neutrophils migrate out into the tissues by a process known as diapedesis. Dia means through, and pedio, pedesis is foot. Putting a foot through and gaining entrance from the blood into the tissues. Okay, this was a question that has 3 blanks. And it said the organ represented by this virtual slice specimen is the blank. What's the organ? 2, the outermost layer is what? And the layer inside that is what? Okay, so let's take a look at it. The correct answers, the organ is heart, and the outermost layer was the epicardium, and the layer just inside that was the myocardium. And some people answered endocardium, but that's not true. So here it is, the heart. Okay, you have to enlarge it to see the nuclei in the center of the cells, see evidence of branching, and if you choose the right area, you may see some intercalated discs, like, well, there's one there, one there. I can enlarge this just a little bit in order to see that more clearly. See, there's an intercalated disc there and one there. Go back to the original magnification that we set for you. And then out here, the outermost layer would be epicardium, which in this case, in this region, has adipose tissue. And then, of course, the next layer is the myocardium. And actually, the endocardium was not present. It was not selected when this specimen was chosen. Okay, question 19 is the longitudinal section through the end of a finger. What is the correct name for the area circled in this virtual slide specimen? Well, the correct answer is the hyponychium. Now, hypo means below, and nychium, that is connection of the nail with the skin. So let's take a look at that. You see, here's the nail right here. This is the skin on top, and this is the skin connecting below. So this would be the eponychium here, and this would be the hyponychium area here. And of course, this is the underside of the fingertip, where you have the fingerprints, and that's what produces these undulations of the interface between the epidermal pegs and the papillary projections of the dermis is what actually makes the fingerprints. And these little grooves here would be the grooves between the elevated areas that make the fingerprints. Okay, the last question, question 20, and says throughout this specimen there are numerous lightly staining sites. One is circled and 2 more are indicated by arrows. Name the cell type that occupies these sites. Again, remind you to take time to read the question and think about what's being asked. 50% of the class got it correct. The correct answer was either macrophage, macrophages, phagocyte, or phagocytes. Now, this was the thymus. So you had to recognize what organ this is, okay? So you look at it like here, you might say, oh, I'm not sure what organ that is. Well, the clue, once again, you only studied so far lymphoid organs, cardiovascular organs, and the integument. So which of those organs would have such solid basophilic staining? Only the lymphoid organs. So we're going to think about the lymphoid organs. And over here on the lower magnification, you can see that there's light areas and dark areas. And the light areas are inside the dark areas. So that suggests the cortex and medulla. Well, once again, you can think, oh, what organs in the lymphoid have a cortex and medulla? You have to know that. Not the spleen, not the tonsil, but the lymph node and the thymus. So now we go back to the original question, and then you can even reduce the magnification here and see that pattern. You can verify that this truly is the thymus by seeing the Hassel's corpuscles in the medulla, and then go back to the original thing we asked about and think about the cortex, because this dark area is the cortex. And those are macrophages that are taking out the cells that are produced that would recognize and destroy the normal genetic makeup surface cells in the body. So these are selecting aberrant cells that are created by the process of taking a naive lymphocyte from the bone marrow and changing it into a CD4 or CD8 with all the surface cells. Okay, I think that now concludes the review of Module 3, Part B. Okay.